Another flipped lecture. Today's topic is the Cold War abroad, the United States versus the Soviet Union. We will be discussing the early years of the Cold War and how the Soviet Union and the United States interacted. To begin with, let's talk about how the Allied powers started planning for post-World War II. They actually started planning before the war was even over, when it seemed pretty sure that Germany was on its way down. The Allied leaders, Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt, met in Yalta in February of 1945 to discuss what would happen when the war finally was over. And they made a few decisions at this meeting. One thing that they decided to do was that after the war, the European nations that had been ruled by Hitler during the war would end up being democratic. Of course, Stalin had a different idea of this, and although he agreed to it at the meeting, he did not follow through. They also created the United Nations in the hope that they would be able to promote and keep world peace after the war. This was much like the League of Nations, except countries actually participated and enforced what the United Nations did, and that's why it's still around today. Other decisions at the Yalta meeting, $20 billion in reparations were going to come from Germany, and a half would go to Russia, who had been hit pretty hard in the war. Also, Russia would get the eastern part of Poland to build up defenses, and land would be taken from East Germany to compensate Poland. Now, when the war actually did end, they had another meeting. This was at the Potsdam Conference in July of 1945. And I should say the war in Europe was over. Potsdam is a town located near Berlin. And again, the leaders from the different Allied countries met. And the big decision here was what to do with Germany. And it was agreed that they needed to rebuild it. They needed to set up a new government. And so they decided that at first Germany would be divided into 4 zones. The United States would have one, the Soviet Union would have another, Great Britain and France would each occupy one until the country could be rebuilt. Now, at this meeting as well, Stalin was told that America had a new weapon. Remember, this is right before the atomic bomb was dropped. But very little information was actually given to Stalin, and he didn't know it was actually the atomic bomb until he heard the news report. So when the bombs were dropped, Stalin realized that America had superior technology. But the United States also knew that Soviets had massive conventional forces in the form of their Red Army. This led to increased tension and problems and issues during the Cold War. Okay, so after the war in Eastern Europe, Stalin desperately wanted to create some sort of a protective barrier around the Soviet Union. He felt like he should be able to do this as no nation in Europe had suffered the devastation they had as a result of the Nazis. This protective barrier, Stalin felt, would make sure that any future war would cause damage in places other than the Soviet Union. And how did he do this? How did he basically take over and create satellite states, countries that were loyal to him and that instituted communist governments? Some of it was through intimidation. People were killed if they stood up against the new system and communism. He also used a lot of propaganda to try and sell his ideas to people in these other nations. And after World War II was over, these countries and these people were very poor. They wanted jobs and food. So to a lot of them, communism sounded okay. So these Eastern European nations that you can see on the map became communist and basically controlled by the Soviets. There were a couple of instances where it was more force was used in order to get the cooperation. For instance, in Poland, all non-communist leaders were killed. There was a, air quote, election in 1947 where 400 out of 450 seats were won by communists, and these were people hand-picked that were loyal to Moscow. In Hungary, although the small Farmers' Party won the large majority of political positions, they all mysteriously left politics, basically because of fear that their lives were at stake. Romania election in 1946 in November, the communists won. In Bulgaria, again, non-communist leaders were killed. In October of 1946, communists won a massive victory. Here is a political cartoon that shows what Stalin was doing. Basically, what Churchill said was he was creating an iron curtain. And this quote from Churchill he actually gave in the United States to try and get Americans to see how serious this was of what Stalin was doing to enlarge his power. He said, "From Stettin in the north to Trieste in the south, an iron curtain has descended over Europe." Basically, that the eastern part of Europe was divided from the western part, communist versus democracies. Because of this, there were many people in the United States government concerned about Stalin's growing influence in Europe. One of them was George Kennan, and he came up with something called the Containment Policy. And that was, he said that U.S. foreign policy should focus on preventing the spread of Soviet communism. This containment policy shaped much of the Cold War and was the reason for some of our actions in the Cold War, such as the war in Korea and Vietnam.